It was one of those sticky summer mornings in Atlanta, when the air feels thick enough to chew. The sun hadn't even climbed high yet, but sweat already dotted the brows of travelers dragging suitcases through Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. Among them was a young woman named Nia, moving slower than most. Not because she was tired, though she was, but because she carried her 6-month-old daughter, Amara, snug against her chest in a soft navy sling. Amara's tiny fingers curled around the fabric of Nia's shirt, her eyes half closed in that hazy space between sleep and wakefulness. Nia had flown plenty of times before, but never alone with a baby. Her husband had been supposed to come with her. They were heading to Denver for a family reunion, but a last-minute board meeting had kept him back. "Go ahead," he'd said over the phone that morning, voice warm with apology. "I'll catch the next flight. You've got this." She'd smiled even though her stomach fluttered with nerves. Now standing in the slow-moving security line, she adjusted the sling and whispered, "We're okay, baby. Just you and me." The flight was Horizon Skies Airlines, a carrier known for its clean cabins and friendly service. Nia had chosen it not just because her husband happened to be its founder, though that didn't hurt, but because she trusted it. She'd seen firsthand how much care went into every detail, from the recycled materials in the seatbacks to the training programs for crew members. Still, none of that mattered right now. All that mattered was getting Amara settled before takeoff. Boarding began, and Nia waited patiently near the front of the line. She held her first-class ticket like a quiet shield, not because she thought she deserved special treatment, she didn't, but because she knew the extra legroom and quieter cabin would make things easier for both of them. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, a flight attendant stood at the door, scanning boarding passes with brisk efficiency. Her name tag read Corinne, and her smile was polite but distant, the kind worn like a uniform. "First class is to your left," Corinne said without looking up. "Thank you," Nia replied softly. She found her seat, window side, just as requested, and carefully lowered herself into it, making sure Amara stayed secure. The cabin smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and warm coffee. A few other passengers drifted in, mostly business travelers with rolled-up sleeves and tired eyes. One man in a navy suit glanced at Nia, then at Amara, then quickly looked away. She pretended not to notice. For the first 10 minutes, everything was calm. Amara dozed lightly, her breathing steady. Nia sipped water from a bottle she'd brought and watched the ground crew outside through the window. But then the plane's engines rumbled to life, and the change in pressure made Amara stir. Her little face scrunched up, and a soft whimper escaped her lips. Then another, then a full cry. Nia's heart clenched. She rocked gently, humming a lullaby under her breath. She unbuttoned her shirt just enough to nurse, draping a light muslin blanket over her shoulder for privacy. It was something she'd done 100 times at home, in cafes, even once in a quiet corner of a grocery store. But here, in the hushed luxury of first class, it felt suddenly exposed. That's when Corinne appeared. She stopped beside Nia's seat, arms crossed just slightly, posture rigid. "Ma'am," she said, voice low but edged with impatience, "could you keep the noise down?" "Other passengers are trying to relax." Nia looked up, startled. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "She's just adjusting to the altitude." "I'm doing my best." Corinne's eyes flicked to Amara, then back to Nia. "There's a bassinet available in economy if you'd prefer to relocate." The words landed like a slap. Nia blinked. "I have a first-class ticket," she said, keeping her voice even. "And she's my child." "I'm not being loud, I'm comforting her." Something shifted in Corinne's expression. Maybe it was the tone. Maybe it was the fact that Nia didn't shrink back the way some passengers did when confronted. Whatever it was, Corinne leaned in, her voice dropping but sharpening. "Look, I understand you're a new mom, but you can't expect everyone else to suffer because your baby won't stop crying." Nia felt heat rise in her cheeks. She wasn't used to being spoken to like this, like she was a problem to be managed, not a person to be helped. "I'm not asking anyone to suffer," she said, meeting Corinne's gaze. "I'm asking for a little understanding. That's all." A businessman 2 rows back cleared his throat loudly. Corinne turned toward him with an apologetic nod, then back to Nia, her jaw tight. "This is a premium cabin," she said. "We have standards." "Standards?" Nia repeated, disbelief creeping into her voice. "You think I don't know what this airline stands for? You think I don't know what it means to treat people with dignity?" Corinne's eyes narrowed. I don't know who you think you are, but you're not above the rules. At that moment, Amara let out a louder cry, a sharp, frustrated wail that echoed in the quiet cabin. Without thinking, Corinne reached out and shoved Nia's shoulder. Not hard enough to knock her over, but hard enough to make her jerk backward into the seat. Amara startled into silence. The cabin went still. A woman across the aisle gasped. Someone fumbled with their phone. Nia's breath caught in her throat. She held Amara tighter, her pulse hammering. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just stared at Corinne, eyes wide with shock and something deeper. Hurt, yes, but also a quiet kind of disappointment, like she'd expected better. Corinne seemed to realize what she'd done a second too late. Her hand dropped to her side. She opened her mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to justify, but no words came out. Then the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a minor delay. Please remain seated. Within minutes, another crew member appeared, whispering urgently to Corinne. Corinne nodded stiffly and walked away, her usual composure fraying at the edges. Nia stayed in her seat, heart pounding. She stroked Amara's back until the baby's breathing slowed again. Outside, the tarmac shimmered in the morning heat. Inside, the air felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. She thought about getting up, about demanding to speak to the captain. But what would that solve? She wasn't looking for a scene. She just wanted to get to Denver, to her family, to a place where she and Amara wouldn't feel like intruders in their own lives. Still, as the plane taxied toward the runway, she pulled out her phone and sent a single text. Something happened. We're okay, but I need to talk when you land. Her husband would know what to do. He always did. But even as she typed it, she wondered if this was about more than just one flight attendant's bad judgment. Maybe it was about the way people assume things based on how you look, how you dress, who you're with, or who you're not with. Maybe it was about the invisible lines people draw in spaces like this and who gets to cross them without question. The plane lifted off, Atlanta shrinking below. Amara finally drifted back to sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling against Nia's. And Nia stared out the window, not at the clouds, but at the reflection of her own face, tired, yes, but resolute. She hadn't come on this trip looking for a fight. But if one found her, she wouldn't back down. Not for herself, but for every mother who'd ever been made to feel small for simply trying to care for her child in public. For every person who'd been told in words or in silence that they didn't belong. The flight was only 2.5 hours. But by the time they touched down in Denver, everything had changed. The wheels of the plane touched down in Denver with a gentle thud, but Nia barely noticed. Her mind was still back in that moment, the shove, the silence that followed, the way her body had tensed like a coiled spring. Amara stirred in her sleep but didn't wake. Her tiny fingers still curled around the edge of Nia's shirt. Outside, the Colorado sun glared off the tarmac, bright and indifferent. As the cabin lights brightened and passengers began unbuckling seatbelts, a man in a dark Horizon Skies uniform appeared at the front of first class. He wasn't part of the flight crew. His badge read Ground Security Liaison. His expression was neutral, but his eyes scanned the cabin with quiet urgency. Ma'am, he said, stopping beside Nia's seat. Could I speak with you for a moment before you disembark? Nia nodded slowly, shifting Amara to her other arm. Is everything okay? We've received a report of an incident during the flight, he said carefully. We'd like to get your statement, she exhaled. Yes, I'd like to file a formal complaint. He guided her off the plane ahead of the other passengers, past the curious glances and hushed whispers. At the jet bridge entrance, 2 airport security officers waited, not with handcuffs or stern faces, but with calm professionalism. They asked if she needed medical attention. She declined. Then they asked if she'd be willing to speak with Horizon Skies' customer relations team on the ground. She agreed. While she waited in a small, quiet lounge near the gate, she finally let herself breathe. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what had just happened. She hadn't been screamed at or thrown off the plane, but she had been touched without consent in front of strangers while holding her child. That wasn't just rude. It was a violation. A woman named Lena from Customer Relations arrived within 10 minutes. She was in her 40s with kind eyes and a voice that sounded like she actually listened when people spoke. She sat across from Nia, not with a clipboard but with a tablet and more importantly with patience. Take your time, Lena said. Tell me what happened. Nia did. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't dramatize. She simply described the exchange, the tone, the moment Corinne's hand made contact with her shoulder. Lena typed quietly, nodding occasionally. When Nia finished, Lena asked, "Would you be comfortable sharing your name and contact information so we can follow up?" "Of course," Nia said, handing over her boarding pass and ID. Lena glanced at the name, Nia Whitmore, and paused. Just for a second. Her eyes flickered upward, then back to the screen. "Thank you," she said, her voice suddenly a little softer. "We'll be in touch very soon." Nia didn't think much of it. She assumed it was just standard procedure. But as she walked toward baggage claim, phone in hand, she saw the first notification pop up on her screen. A message from her husband. "I heard. Are you and Amara okay?" She frowned. "Heard what?" She typed back. Before she could hit send, another message came through. Someone sent a video to the corporate office. It's already circulating internally. Her stomach dropped. She hadn't even known anyone had recorded it. Back in Atlanta, Malik sat in his office, still in his suit from the morning meeting. The video had been forwarded to him by his head of operations with a single line. "You need to see this." He'd watched it 3 times. Each time his chest tightened a little more. There was his wife, calm, composed, doing nothing but trying to soothe their daughter, and then without warning, the shove. Quick, sharp, unmistakable, he didn't yell. He didn't slam his fist on the desk. He just sat there, jaw clenched, staring at the frozen image on his screen. This wasn't just about Nia. It was about everything Horizon Skies claimed to stand for. Respect, dignity, humanity in the skies. And one of their own had broken that trust in front of dozens of witnesses. Within the hour, an emergency call went out to HR, legal, and senior leadership. Corinne's access badge was deactivated. Her scheduled flights for the week were canceled. An internal investigation was launched, not as a formality but as a necessity. Meanwhile, the video, grainy, shot from a passenger's phone, began to spread. Not virally, not yet, but enough. A travel blogger posted a short clip with the caption, "Flight attendant shoves mom holding baby. Airline stays silent." A few news outlets picked it up as a developing story. Comments poured in, some angry, some skeptical, some defending Corinne as just doing her job. But the majority asked the same question. Why wasn't the passenger removed if she was causing a disturbance? What they didn't know, and what the video didn't show, was that Amara's crying had lasted less than 2 minutes. That Nia had been nursing discreetly. That she'd apologized before she'd even been asked to. But online, nuance rarely survives the scroll. Nia, for her part, stayed off social media. She checked into her hotel, fed Amara, and took a long shower, letting the hot water wash away the tension in her shoulders. When her phone buzzed again, it was Lena. "Ms. Whitmore," Lena said, voice gentle but formal. "I've been asked to connect you directly with Mr. Whitmore's office. Would that be all right?" Nia almost laughed. "You can just connect me to my husband, Lena." A pause. Then a soft chuckle. "Right, of course," Malik answered on the first ring. "Nia, talk to me." She told him everything, the boarding, the tension, the shove, the way Corinne had looked at her like she was an inconvenience rather than a person. And then she said something that surprised even her. "This wasn't just about me." "What do you mean?" he asked. I kept thinking, what if I wasn't married to you? What if I was just another black woman flying alone with a baby in first class? Would anyone have believed me? Would anyone have cared?" The line went quiet for a moment. Then Malik said, "They should care, regardless." That night, while Amara slept in the crib beside the hotel bed, Nia scrolled through old emails from Horizon Skies' customer service team. She remembered a complaint she'd read months ago. A woman named Tasha, flying from Chicago to Miami, told she must have boarded the wrong cabin, despite showing her ticket. Another from a father named Dev asked to control his toddler or move to the back. These weren't isolated. They were echoes. Back in Atlanta, Corinne sat at her kitchen table, blinds drawn, phone silenced. Her union rep had called earlier. "They're treating this seriously," he'd said, "especially because of who she is." Corinne hadn't known. She hadn't recognized Nia. She'd just seen a young woman, a crying baby, and assumed she didn't belong. Now, The weight of that assumption pressed down on her like a stone. She thought about her 12 years with the airline, the early mornings, the holiday flights, the passengers who'd thanked her with tears in their eyes. She'd always prided herself on being professional, on keeping order. But somewhere along the way, order had become code for people who look and act like me. She drafted an apology email 3 times, deleted it each time. Words felt too small now. The next morning, Horizon Skies issued a brief public statement. We are aware of an incident involving a passenger and crew member on Flight 427. We take all reports of misconduct seriously and are conducting a full internal review. Our priority is the safety and dignity of every person who flies with us. It wasn't enough for some, too much for others. But for Nia, it was a start. She called Malik again before heading to the family reunion. Don't fire her, she said. He was quiet. After what she did? Punishment won't fix the problem, Nia said. But accountability might. Make her understand why it happened. Make sure it never happens to someone who doesn't have a voice like mine. Malik sighed. You're asking me to lead with compassion when I want to lead with consequences. Then lead with both, she said gently. And just like that, the path forward began to take shape. Not in anger, but in intention. Not in revenge, but in repair. By the time Nia arrived at her cousin's house in the Denver suburbs, Amara was giggling in her carrier, reaching for the leaves on a low-hanging tree. The sun was warm, the air crisp. For a moment, the flight felt far away, but Nia knew it wasn't over. Not really, because what happened at 30,000 feet wasn't just about one bad moment. It was about the quiet biases that live in everyday interactions, the assumptions, the snap judgments, the invisible lines drawn in places that should feel safe for everyone. And maybe, just maybe, this was the moment those lines started to blur. The days after the flight blurred together in a strange mix of quiet and chaos. For Nia, life in Denver settled into a rhythm. Mornings with Amara in the backyard, afternoons helping her aunt prepare food for the family reunion, evenings watching the mountains turn gold in the sunset. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but beneath it something had shifted. She caught herself watching how people moved around her, how they made space, how they spoke, whether their eyes lingered just a second too long or looked away too quickly. It wasn't paranoia. It was awareness. The kind that comes when you realize how easily you can be made to feel out of place, even when you've done nothing wrong. Back in Atlanta, the atmosphere at Horizon Skies headquarters was anything but calm. Malik hadn't slept well since the video surfaced. He'd always believed his airline was different, that the values he and his team had built into every policy, every training module, every hiring decision actually meant something. But now, faced with hard evidence that those values hadn't reached everyone, he felt a quiet kind of grief. Not for his company's reputation, though that was taking hits, but for the trust that had been broken. He called an emergency all-hands meeting, not just for executives, but for every department, flight operations, customer service, HR, even maintenance. People joined from hangars, from remote offices, from home. When Malik stepped onto the virtual stage, he didn't open with statistics or damage control. He opened with a question. How many of you have ever been told you don't belong somewhere just because of how you looked, who you were with, or what you were carrying? The chat window stayed silent for a long moment. Then slowly messages began to appear. On a flight once. They asked to see my ticket 3 times. My son was crying in economy. The attendant said, maybe you shouldn't fly with kids. I'm a pilot. Still get asked if I'm the flight attendant. Malik read them aloud, voice steady. This isn't about one flight attendant. This is about a pattern we've ignored because it was easier to call it isolated incidents than to admit we have work to do. He then shared something he'd never made public. Horizon Skies had quietly tracked passenger complaints by demographic for the past 2 years. The data wasn't perfect. People didn't always disclose race or background, but the trend was clear. Passengers who were women of color, especially those traveling with young children, were far more likely to be questioned, moved, or spoken to harshly, even when their behavior matched that of other passengers. We built this airline to be a place where dignity isn't a privilege, he said. It's a promise, and right now we're not keeping it. Meanwhile, Corinne sat alone in her apartment, blinds still drawn. Her phone buzzed constantly. Some messages from concerned coworkers, others from strangers who'd seen the video online. A few were supportive. Most were angry. One called her a racist monster. She deleted it without reading the rest. Her union rep had warned her, they could terminate you. Given who she is, they might want to make an example. But days passed and no termination letter came. Instead, she received an email from HR. You are required to participate in a new company-wide training program on bias awareness and de-escalation. Attendance is mandatory. Non-compliance will result in further disciplinary action. She stared at the screen. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't the end either. What she didn't know was that Nia had asked Malik not to fire her outright. If you fire her, Nia had said during one of their late-night calls, nothing changes. The next flight attendant might do the same thing to someone who doesn't have your last name. But if you help her understand why it happened and make sure others learn from it, you might actually fix something. Malik had argued at first. She put her hands on you, Nia, with Amara right there. I know, Nia replied, but I don't want her punished. I want her changed. Now, as Corinne scrolled through the training syllabus, modules on implicit bias, cultural humility, trauma-informed customer service, she felt a strange mix of shame and relief. Shame for what she'd done, relief that someone, somewhere, believed she could do better. She thought back to that morning on the plane. She remembered how tired she'd been. Double shifts all week, her own son homesick with a fever, the pressure of being passed over for a promotion she'd worked years for. None of that excused what she did, but it explained the edge in her voice, the quickness of her hand. Stress doesn't create bias, but it sharpens it, makes it easier to act on without thinking. One evening, she sat at her kitchen table and wrote a letter. Not for social media, not for HR, just for herself. I saw a young black woman with a crying baby, and I assumed she didn't belong in first class. I didn't see a mother. I saw a problem, and that's on me. Not because I'm evil, but because I've been trained, maybe without even knowing it, to equate calmness with worthiness, silence with respectability. And that's not how humanity works. She folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer. Maybe she'd never send it, but writing it felt like the first honest thing she'd done in a long time. At the same time, Malik met with a group of consultants, educators, former flight attendants of color, psychologists who specialized in workplace equity. Together, they designed a new training program unlike anything Horizon Skies had done before. No lectures, no check-the-box videos. Instead, real stories, role-playing scenarios, small group discussions where crew members could talk about their own experiences, both as service providers and as people who'd been misjudged themselves. The program would be rolled out in phases, and Corinne would be in the first cohort. Back in Denver, Nia received a call from Lena, the customer relations lead. We'd like to invite you to speak with Corinne, Lena said gently. Not as a confrontation, just a conversation. If you're open to it, Nia hesitated. She hadn't expected this. Why? Because she's asked to understand, and because you asked for accountability, not punishment. Nia looked down at Amara, now babbling happily in her high chair, smearing mashed sweet potato on the tray. She thought about all the times she'd wanted to be seen, not as a CEO's wife, not as a problem passenger, but just as a person trying her best. Okay, she said, but only if it's private. No cameras, no notes, just us. Lena agreed. The meeting was set for 2 weeks later back in Atlanta, in a quiet conference room at Horizon Skies headquarters. No managers, no lawyers, just 2 women, a baby, and the space between them. In the days leading up to it, Nia didn't rehearse what she'd say. She didn't plan speeches or accusations. She just thought about what she wished someone had said to her in that moment on the plane. I see you. I'm here to help. And maybe, just maybe, that was still possible, even after everything. Corinne, for her part, spent the week reviewing every module of the new training. She listened to recordings of passengers describing being followed in airports, questioned about their tickets, told to calm down when they were already speaking softly. She cried once, not out of self-pity, but out of recognition. She'd been part of that system, not because she hated anyone, but because she'd never questioned it. The night before the meeting, she stood in front of her mirror and practiced saying 3 words. I was wrong. Not, I'm sorry if you were offended. Not, I didn't mean to. Just, I was wrong. It felt terrifying. And necessary. Because real change doesn't start with grand gestures. It starts with two people, sitting across from each other, willing to say the hard things and listen to the harder ones. And in that quiet room, with sunlight filtering through the blinds and Amara playing softly on a blanket at Nia's feet, that's exactly what they would try to do. The morning of the meeting was quiet in a way that felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Corinne arrived at Horizon Sky's headquarters 20 minutes early, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't sit still at home. She wore her uniform, not because she had to, but because it felt honest. This wasn't a social visit. It was part of her job, part of her reckoning. She waited in the lobby, hands folded in her lap, watching the sunlight move across the polished floor. Her stomach twisted with nerves, but beneath that was something quieter. Hope. Not the kind that expects everything to be fixed in a day, but the kind that believes change is possible even when it's hard. Upstairs, Nia stepped off the elevator with Amara strapped to her chest in the same navy sling from the flight. She hadn't planned to bring her daughter, but Amara had woken up fussy, and Nia couldn't bear the thought of leaving her with a sitter for something this important. Besides, Amara was part of this story too, not just a prop in someone else's drama, but a living reminder of why dignity matters, especially when you're small and dependent and trusting the world to be kind. Lena met them at the door of the conference room. "She's already inside," she said softly. "Take your time." Nia nodded and stepped in. The room was simple, wooden table, 4 chairs, a pitcher of water, no recording devices, no notebooks. Just space. Corinne stood as Nia entered, then hesitated, unsure whether to offer a handshake. She settled for a small, respectful nod. "Thank you for coming," Corinne said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nia sat across from her, adjusting Amara's blanket. "I wasn't sure I would," she admitted. "But I wanted to see if we could talk like people, not just roles." Corinne swallowed. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know I've been trying to understand why I did what I did." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound Amara's soft coos as she reached for a loose thread on Nia's sleeve. Then Corinne took a breath and said the words she'd practiced. "I was wrong." Nia looked up. "Okay," she said. "Tell me what you think you were wrong about." And Corinne did. She didn't hide behind "I was stressed" or "I didn't mean it." She spoke plainly. "I saw you, a young black woman alone with a baby, and I assumed you didn't belong in first class. I thought you were being disruptive when you were just being a mom, and when you didn't shrink away like I expected, I felt challenged. So I used my authority to put you in your place. That wasn't professionalism. That was control, and it was wrong." Nia listened, her expression unreadable at first. Then she leaned forward slightly. "Do you know how many times I've been asked to show my ticket, even after I've already boarded? How many times people have looked at me like I stole my seat?" Corinne shook her head. "No, but I believe you." "That day," Nia continued, "I wasn't just scared for myself. I was scared for Amara. What if she grows up thinking the world will always question her right to be somewhere? What if she learns to make herself small just to be safe?" Corinne's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I never thought about it like that." "You wouldn't have to," Nia said gently. "That's the point." They talked for over an hour, not in accusations but in questions. Corinne asked how Nia wanted to be treated in moments of stress. Nia asked what Corinne needed to feel supported in her job without taking it out on passengers. They didn't solve everything, but they listened, really listened. At one point, Amara let out a happy squeal and reached toward Corinne. Without thinking, Corinne smiled, a real one, and held out a finger. Amara grabbed it, giggling. It was a tiny moment, but it felt like a bridge. After they parted ways, neither woman claimed victory. But something had shifted, not just between them, but in the air around them. Back at headquarters, Malik watched from a distance, not in the room, but through updates from Lena. He'd wanted to be there, but Nia had insisted, "This isn't about you, it's about us." Now, he used what came from that conversation to reshape the airline's future. The new training program, co-developed with civil rights educators and frontline staff, was rolled out to all customer-facing employees. It wasn't a one-time seminar. It was ongoing, Monthly workshops, peer-led discussions, anonymous feedback channels where crew could report bias without fear of retaliation. And Corinne? She didn't return to first class right away. Instead, she was offered a new role, mentoring new hires in de-escalation and cultural humility. At first, she resisted. After what I did, they'll never listen to me. But Lena said, that's exactly why they need to hear from you. Not as a perfect example, but as someone who made a mistake and chose to grow. So Corinne stood in front of new flight attendants not with a script, but with her story. She showed them the video, her own hands, her own voice, and said, this is what happens when we stop seeing people and start seeing problems. Some trainees were skeptical. Others were moved. A few shared their own stories of being misjudged, by passengers, by coworkers, even by family. The room became a space not of shame, but of shared learning. Meanwhile, Horizon Skies made the training program public, inviting other airlines to adopt it. They didn't boast. They just shared the materials, the framework, the lessons learned. A few competitors scoffed, but others reached out quietly, asking for guidance. Passenger feedback began to change. Complaints about disruptive families dropped by 40% in 6 months. Crew members reported feeling more equipped to handle tense moments with empathy instead of authority. And for the first time, the airline's internal survey showed that employees of color felt more seen, more valued, more safe speaking up. Naya didn't take credit. She never posted about it online. But she did start flying again, this time with Malik and Amara both beside her. On one flight, a new flight attendant knelt beside their seats and said, Ms. Whitmore, I just want you to know I went through the training. And I'm glad you spoke up, Nia smiled. I'm glad you listened. Back home, Corinne began volunteering with a local parenting group, helping new moms navigate travel with infants. She still carried the weight of what she'd done, but now it felt less like a burden and more like a compass, guiding her toward better choices. One evening, she received a handwritten note in the mail. No return address, just her name on the front. Inside was a single sentence. Thank you for choosing to grow. She knew who it was from. She kept the note on her fridge next to a photo of her son. Change didn't happen overnight. There were still hard days, awkward moments, systems that resisted shifting, but something real had taken root. Not in punishment, but in patience. Not in blame, but in belief that people can do better when they're given the chance. And in the quiet spaces between flights, between conversations, between heartbeats, that belief began to spread. A year had passed since that flight from Atlanta to Denver, and the world hadn't been turned upside down, at least not in the way headlines might suggest. There were no grand courtroom dramas, no viral redemption arcs, no dramatic firings or tearful press conferences. But if you looked closely, you'd see the quiet ripples of something deeper. A shift not in spectacle, but in substance. Nia stood near the gate at Hartsfield-Jackson once again, but this time everything felt different. Amara, now a bright-eyed toddler with a mop of curly hair and a love for airplanes, tugged at her hand, pointing excitedly at the jet parked outside. Plane up, she said, bouncing on her toes. Nia smiled and knelt beside her. Yes, baby. We're going up. This wasn't just another trip. It was the first official flight of the Horizon Family Travel Initiative, a program Nia and Malik had quietly developed over months of listening, planning, and testing. It wasn't flashy. No celebrity endorsements, no million-dollar ad campaign. Just simple, human-centered changes. Priority boarding for families with young children. Designated quiet zones during nap times. Complimentary bassinets in all cabins. And on-call lactation support at major hubs. Most importantly, every crew member received training not just in safety procedures, but in empathy. How to recognize stress, how to offer help without judgment, how to see a crying child not as a disruption, but as a signal that someone might need support. As they walked down the jet bridge, a flight attendant greeted them with a warm smile. Ms. Whitmore, and this must be Amara. She knelt to the toddler's level. Welcome aboard. We've got your favorite seat ready, extra legroom and a little surprise in the seat back pocket. Amara grinned and clapped her hands. Inside the cabin, everything felt calmer, softer. A young father nearby was struggling to buckle his son into a car seat adapter. Before Nia could even react, another attendant appeared, gently offering to help. No sighs, no side-eye. Just kindness offered like it was the most natural thing in the world. Nia settled into her seat, watching Amara press her nose against the window, already whispering, "Bye-bye, ground." She thought back to that day a year ago. The tension, the shove, the silence that followed. It hadn't broken her, but it had changed her. Not by making her bitter, but by making her braver. She hadn't set out to become an advocate. She just wanted to fly with her daughter without being treated like an intruder. But sometimes the most powerful movements begin with a single no. Not shouted, but spoken firmly with dignity. Later that week, Nia was invited to speak at a private industry forum on equity in air travel. She almost declined. She wasn't a public speaker. She didn't want the spotlight. But then she remembered all the mothers who'd messaged her after the story quietly surfaced. Not with outrage, but with quiet gratitude. "Thank you for saying what I couldn't." So she went. She didn't stand behind a podium. She sat in a circle with airline executives, union reps, and frontline staff. And when it was her turn, she didn't talk about policies or statistics. She told a story. "I was just a mom trying to get my baby to sleep," she said, voice steady. "I wasn't asking for special treatment. I was asking to be treated like a person. And when that was denied, not with words but with a shove, I realized something. Real inclusion isn't about who gets a first-class seat. It's about who gets to exist in a space without having to prove they belong." She paused, then added, "Change doesn't start when we ask, 'Did this happen?' It starts when we ask, 'Why did this keep happening, and who have we been ignoring while it did?'" The room was silent for a long moment. Then, one by one, people began to nod. Back at Horizon Skies, Corinne had become something unexpected, a trusted voice in crew training. She still flew occasionally, but her real impact was in the classroom, leading workshops where new hires practiced responding to real-life scenarios. She never positioned herself as a hero. She called herself a witness. "I used to think being professional meant staying calm no matter what," she told a group one afternoon. "But real professionalism means seeing the human behind the behavior. A crying baby isn't a problem to be silenced. A tired parent isn't a nuisance to be moved. They're people who trusted us with their journey. And that trust is sacred." Some trainees were skeptical at first. "Isn't that just coddling?" one asked. Corinne shook her head. "It's not about coddling. It's about connection. You can uphold standards and still show kindness. In fact, that's when standards mean something." Her honesty disarmed people. She didn't hide her mistake. She used it as a teaching tool, not to shame herself, but to show that growth is possible even after you've failed. Meanwhile, Malik had shifted how he led. He still ran board meetings and signed contracts, but he also spent one morning a month working the customer service desk, listening to real passenger concerns. He made it a rule that every executive had to do the same. "If you don't hear the truth from the ground," he'd say, "you'll only make decisions based on what looks good on paper." The airline didn't become perfect overnight. There were still misunderstandings, still moments of tension. But now there was a system in place to address them, not with punishment as the first response, but with conversation, learning, and repair. One afternoon, Naya received a package with no return address. Inside was a small handmade airplane carved from wood, with Amara's name etched on the side. Tucked beneath it was a note, "For the little one who taught us all to look up." She knew it was from Corinne. She placed the plane on Amara's bookshelf, where it sat beside stuffed animals and board books. Months later, on another Horizon Skies flight, Amara spotted a baby crying a few rows ahead. Without prompting, she tugged Nia's sleeve and pointed. "Baby sad," she said, then held out her favorite stuffed rabbit. "Give Bunny?" Nia's heart swelled. She walked over with Amara and gently offered the toy to the tired-looking mother. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "We've had a rough morning." "No worries," Nia said. "We've all been there." In that moment, the circle felt complete, not because everything was fixed, but because care was being passed forward hand to hand, heart to heart. The legacy of that one flight wasn't a scandal or a scandal avoided. It was a quiet transformation, one that showed that accountability doesn't have to mean destruction, that dignity isn't a luxury but a baseline, that even in the high-pressure world of commercial aviation, there's room for grace, and sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to be invisible, and another choosing to see them, to change the course of something much bigger than themselves. As the plane lifted into the sky, Amara pressed her hand against the window, watching the world shrink below. Nia wrapped an arm around her, not as the wife of an airline CEO, not as a symbol of a movement, but simply as a mother, present, protected, and finally, fully at ease. The clouds stretched out ahead, endless and open, and for the first time in a long time, the sky didn't feel like a place to endure. It felt like a place to belong,